In the summer of 1933, Louis Armstrong was 31 years old and more tired than he allowed most people to see. The preceding years had demanded what very full years demand: constant performance, constant travel, the specific accumulated cost of a schedule that was organized around productivity rather than sustainability, that assumed the instrument of a human body and mind would simply continue producing at the required level, regardless of what that requirement was extracting. He had been performing at high levels of output for most of the decade. He was not finished. He was not broken, but he was tired in a way that rest alone would not reach, that required something more than a day off, that had in it the specific quality of a man who needed to be somewhere different before he could understand what was wrong with where he was. The European tour of 1933 was, on the surface, a commercial arrangement, a series of engagements in England and Scandinavia and France, organized through the booking networks that the American entertainment industry used to access the European market. Armstrong had not been to Europe before. He had heard about it from other musicians who had, from the black American jazz musicians who had been making the crossing since the early 1920s, and who brought back reports of something that was difficult to convey with full accuracy: that in Europe, the music was received differently, and the man who played it was received differently. And the difference was specific and significant in ways that required being there to fully understand. The specific difference that European reception offered a black American musician in 1933 was not simply a matter of enthusiasm. American audiences, in the cities where Armstrong had been performing, were enthusiastic. The crowds were large. The applause was real. What was different in Europe was not the quantity of the reception, but its quality, the specific social dimensions of what the reception included and what it excluded. In Europe, in 1933, Louis Armstrong was simply a musician. In America, in 1933, Louis Armstrong was a black musician, which meant that the reception, however warm, always occurred within a structure that placed him in a specific position relative to the white audiences and the wide commercial infrastructure through which most of his income and most of his visibility moved. The hotels that were unavailable to him, the restaurants, the specific rituals of American racial segregation that a touring black musician encountered not once or twice, but daily, continuously, as the persistent texture of working life. The appreciation for the music existed alongside the structure. The structure did not pause for the appreciation. When Armstrong arrived in England in the summer of 1933 and then moved on to Scandinavia, to Copenhagen, where he would play concerts that the Danish audience received with the particular quality of European jazz enthusiasm, which combined genuine musical knowledge with a warmth that had nothing of the condescension that American warmth sometimes contained, something happened that those who were with him described as a visible relaxation. Not the relaxation of a tired man in a comfortable chair, the relaxation of a man who has been carrying something heavy and has set it down and is discovering, in the brief absence of the weight, what the weight had been doing to him. He had not set it down permanently, he knew that. The structure he was temporarily outside of in Copenhagen was the structure he would return to. But for the duration of the Danish concerts, and for the time between the concerts when he moved through Copenhagen as a man who was, in this city, simply what his music said he was, for that time, something was different. And the something different produced a question he had not been expecting to have to answer. The musicians and writers and other black Americans who were living in Europe in 1933, who had made the decision, permanent or extended, to remain on the European side of the Atlantic, were people Armstrong encountered during this period. Some of them were jazz musicians. Some were writers and visual artists. They were people who had answered, with their physical presence in cities like Paris and Copenhagen, the question that Armstrong was now finding himself asking. Their answers were not uniform. Some of them experienced European life as a genuine liberation, as the place where the specific costs of being a Black American were lifted sufficiently that a different quality of creative life became possible. Some of them found that Europe had its own complications, its own ways of assigning people to positions that were different but not entirely unlike the positions they had left. Some of them missed America, missed the specific quality of Black American culture and community that Europe, for all its freedom from certain specific American burdens, could not replicate. Armstrong listened to these accounts with the particular quality of attention he brought to things that were directly relevant to his own situation. He was not going to decide, on the basis of one European tour, that his life should be reorganized around a permanent address in Copenhagen. He was not that kind of person, not someone who made large structural decisions quickly, not someone who responded to the temporary relief of a difficult situation by concluding that the relief was the solution. He was a man who thought carefully about things that mattered, who understood the difference between a good week and a changed life, and who was not going to confuse one for the other. But he also understood what the tour was showing him. It was showing him that the specific weight he had been carrying was not simply the weight of a demanding career. It was the weight of a demanding career conducted inside a structure that added a particular dimension of cost to everything the career required. The tiredness that he had brought to the ship in 1933 was not just the tiredness of a man who had played too many concerts. It was the tiredness of a man who had done everything the career required while simultaneously navigating the specific structures of American racial life, and who had done this without rest, without a break from the navigation, for the entire length of his adult working life. He came back. He had always known he would come back. The decision was not about permanence. It was about understanding. He needed to know what was possible in a place where certain specific things were different, in order to understand, with more clarity than he'd had before, what the things that were different had been costing him. He came back with that clarity, and with something else, a specific knowledge that the tiredness could be relieved, that the navigation could be paused, that there was a version of being Louis Armstrong that did not require the continuous management of the structure alongside everything else. He could not access that version in America, but knowing it existed changed something about his understanding of what he was doing and what he was carrying when he did it. The question was whether America was where he needed to be, not as a permanent decision, not as a manifesto about the structure of American racial life, not as a rejection of the country that had produced him and the music he played, as a practical question about where a man could best do what he was trying to do, which was play music and reach people with it, and do this in conditions that allowed him to be, during the time he was doing it, something other than exhausted. The European jazz world of 1933 was not a fantasy. It had its own complications, its own specific ways in which American black musicians were received that were not without their own condescensions and misapprehensions. The European enthusiasm for jazz was sometimes the enthusiasm of connoisseurs for an artifact, a product of a culture they found fascinating precisely because it was alien to them. And this quality of enthusiastic othering was not the same as being simply seen and heard as a musician. Armstrong was sophisticated enough to understand the difference, and to not mistake the enthusiasm for something it wasn't entirely. But it was also, simultaneously, an environment in which certain specific features of Armstrong's daily life in America were absent. The hotel that would not accommodate him, the restaurant that would not seat him, the concert promoter who spoke to him as though the achievements that the audience was coming to witness were somehow separate from the man who had made them. These specific features were not present in Copenhagen in 1933. Their absence was felt as an absence, as something missing from the daily texture of things, in the specific way that the removal of a persistent pressure feels like lightness, rather than simply neutrality. Armstrong had spent his career navigating these features with the particular combination of grace and stubbornness that had allowed him to build what he had built. He had not allowed them to stop him. He had not allowed them to define his public self, or limit his musical output, or reduce the quality of what he brought to the rooms he performed in. But the navigation had cost him, in the way that continuous navigation always costs the person doing it, in ways that are not always visible and that do not appear in the official record of a career. In Copenhagen, in 1933, the navigation was temporarily unnecessary, and in its absence, something else was possible. He could simply be in the city. He could walk through it, sit in its cafes, move through its streets, be recognized when he was recognized as the musician who was playing at the concert hall, and receive that recognition without the specific layers of complication that followed recognition in America. This was not paradise. It was just a city where certain things were different, and the difference was, for a man who had been dealing with those things his entire adult life, surprisingly significant. What Armstrong carried home from the 1933 European tour was not a new political position, and not a manifesto, and not a public statement about the nature of American racial life and what it required of the people living inside it. He carried home what he had found in Copenhagen and London and Paris, the specific knowledge that the music, in a place where its reception was not filtered through the specific architecture of American racial division, could reach people in a way that felt cleaner and more direct, and less freighted with the accumulated cost of the navigation. He carried this knowledge quietly. He did not announce it. He did not make it the subject of interviews or public statements. He returned to America and to the touring schedule and the commercial landscape and the daily navigation of the structure that the European months had temporarily suspended. He played the music. He continued. He was, in his public presentation, what he had always been, warm, generous, directed outward at whatever audience was in front of him. But the knowledge was there, and it shaped, in ways that are visible in retrospect, the way Armstrong related to the European tours that continued throughout his career, the particular quality of engagement and openness that characterized his European performances in the decades that followed, the specific attention he brought to the European audiences and the European musicians and the European cities that was different in quality from the professional thoroughness he brought to everything. He had been to Europe. He knew what it was. He knew what the difference felt like. And he went back whenever the schedule allowed. The question he had asked himself in 1933, whether America was where he needed to be, did not have a simple answer, and he did not arrive at one. He needed America in the way that people need the place that produced them, for the roots, the community, the specific quality of Black American music and culture that no European city could replicate. He also needed, periodically, the relief of being somewhere where certain specific things were different. He managed these two needs as he managed most things, without direct statement, through the practical arrangements of his life, by going to Europe when he could and coming home when he needed to, and playing the music in both places with the same fullness and the same generosity and the same precise attention to whatever room he was in. The 1933 tour was the first time he had encountered the question. He came back from it with a more complete picture of what his situation was. Not a resolved picture, not one that the question had been answered and set aside, but a more complete one. He knew things he had not known before. He knew that the tiredness could be relieved. He knew that the relief was real and that it was temporary, and that the decision to live inside the American structure, rather than outside it, was a decision he would continue to make, with a specific kind of eyes-open deliberateness that most decisions of that kind require. In the summer of 1933, Louis Armstrong left America exhausted. He found something in Europe he had not expected to find, a version of his own life in which certain specific weights were absent. He thought about not coming back. He came back. But what he had found in those months stayed with him for the rest of his career. A knowledge of what was possible, carried quietly, that made everything he did afterward slightly different from everything he had done before.